college football is kind of strange sometimes when it comes to rivalries. You've got the national ones. Now, those are the ones on the front page of all the storybooks in the history of college football. I don't need to tell anyone, even if you're not from the South, about the Iron Bowl. Recently, Alabama-LSU has been a huge rivalry. Georgia-Florida is really big down here. And I also don't need to tell anyone nationally that, hey, Michigan-Ohio State, really big rivalry. OU-Texas, really big rivalry. No one needs to be told that. But there are these sort of regional pockets. That's really what college football is, just a bunch of regional pockets. And there are certain games that matter really a great deal in those regional pockets that probably aren't talked about a whole lot nationally. One of those is Alabama versus Georgia. You have seen these teams play a few times recently, but by and large, they're not regular crossover divisional opponents. They don't reside in the same division of the SEC. They don't play regularly, last few seasons notwithstanding. And it's not talked about as a national rivalry. But I want to tell you, it's a huge deal down here, and I had a question or two about it in the Late Kick Extra inbox for the podcast, and I figured, well, we've got 5 people asking about this. Why don't we just go ahead and talk about it on the show? The way I've always described these fan bases is that Eddie Lacy? Colin? Yeah, it is. These fan bases, just take Alabama, Georgia, put them side by side, let's make a big pie chart out of it, and just split it into quadrants. Because you do not have a consensus on either side of the aisle when it comes to how people view this quote-unquote rivalry. You've got Alabama fans who focus on Auburn first and foremost and really get aggravated when a portion of their fan base tends to obsess with Georgia. You've got another portion of the Alabama fan base who says Georgia's a lot bigger threat to us in terms of getting to a national championship than Auburn is, and we really feel like they recruit more on par with us, and if we take care of our business, we'll beat Auburn. Georgia's the one who has our attention. And then on the other side of the Chattahoochee River, you got Georgia fans who say, why don't we focus on Florida? Like, why do you guys worry about Alabama? They're not even on our regular season schedule this year notwithstanding. And then you got other folks in the state of Georgia and in the Georgia fan base who say, hey, man, that's the standard there. And until we beat them, it doesn't matter. We've handled Florida. This is the team in our way. There is no consensus. Even as I talk about this, Georgia fans and Bama fans argue about this. There are sizable portions of each respective fan base that say, what are you so worried about Georgia for? What are you so worried about Alabama for? Let me tell you, having grown up on the border of Alabama and Georgia geographically and having gone to middle school, elementary school, high school, all my life I have spent sandwiched in the middle of this stuff. Georgia hates Alabama for a number of reasons. But let me tell you really what it comes down to. Alabama, at least under Nick Saban, has been, for the last decade plus, what Georgia always should have been in the mind of a Georgia fan. Georgia fan looks at Bama and what they've done under Saban, and they think to themselves, and they're not wrong, by the way, what is it they have that's allowing them to do what they've done that we aren't capable of? And the answer is nothing. Bama fan will retort with, we got more tradition. What kind of tradition did Clemson have until they started winning national championships and going to the playoff every year? Very overrated. What it takes is it takes full buy-in. Financially and otherwise, it takes full buy-in. And Saban walked in Alabama and backhanded a bunch of people across the mouth, maybe in some cases literally, but really figuratively he did that, and he took them by the shoulders and he woke them up and said, this is what we got to do if you want these kinds of results. And Saban got it. Mark Richt did not get that at Georgia. Biggest credit to Kirby Smart, as I've said a number of times over the last few months, he has gotten it at Georgia. So only recently has the head coach at Georgia, being Kirby Smart, gotten full buy-in at his respective outpost to the degree that Nick Saban has. Still hadn't beaten Alabama, though. So you've got that to worry about, and you got Kirby Smart that has forced some change there. As for the Alabama side of things, there is a perception amongst pretty much the entirety of the Alabama fan base that there's an arrogance about Alabama that is earned. They point, or there's no need to point any further than the trophy case. There's an arrogance that's earned, and they look over in Athens, Georgia, and places elsewhere, and they see a very similar arrogance to the kind they have. They just don't think it's earned. They look at their trophy case, and they say, there's 09, there's 11, there's 12, there's 15, there's 17. We can't even fit all these in our hands anymore. And Georgia, you have, if not for us, maybe you'd have a lot, but right now you have. And so that's part one of what aggravates them. But I'll tell you, if you dive a little bit deeper Bear Bryant, when he was at Alabama, used to always say, if the University of Florida ever got their act together, they would be a terror for the rest of us to deal with. He understood the untapped potential of that program. And I think now that Florida has long since had the Spurrier era and the Meyer era, they've won big down there. A lot of people in college football in the SEC and in Alabama circles had looked at Georgia and said, Rick's over there and he's doing a good job, but good sometimes is the enemy of great. If they were to ever get a guy in there that got them fully on board to the degree we are here in Tuscaloosa, they would be a nightmare to deal with. And Kirby Smart, I'm not telling you he's Nick Saban 2.0. I am telling you he's gotten everybody fully on board over there. There are no 14 people sometimes pulling in 14 different directions, and let's take care of the men's putt-putt team before we fully invest in an extra 2 bodies for the recruiting staff. Those aren't conversations they have at Georgia anymore. So a lot of people are threatened by it. Even though they haven't beaten you yet, a lot of people are threatened by it. But I want you, if you want to understand the vitriol and the hatred, especially from the G towards the A, think about it. Take yourself, close your eyes if you want to, and put yourself in the shoes of a Georgia Bulldog fan. I'm talking die-hard Georgia Bulldog fan. You live, sleep, eat, breathe with every snap. You know every 3-star recruit you sign. They don't do that so much anymore, much less the 5 stars. And I want you to go back to 2007, 8. Nick Saban comes into Alabama. Mark Richt's already been at Georgia. Actually beat Alabama your first year over there in Tuscaloosa. I think that's a game I was at, an overtime game. But anyway, you fast forward a few years, and there Saban wins a championship in 2009, and then you meet them in Atlanta, SEC title game, 2012, and you're flying down the field with not much time left, and you get towards the end zone, and all of a sudden, you run out of time. It's just this close. Right there. There's the play. Colin's showing it to you. That is how close Georgia is to the end zone when the SEC championship game ends. Alabama wins. They go on to face a badly outmanned Notre Dame team. You are sitting at home knowing full well this right here in Atlanta, GA was the national title game. If you win that one, you're probably going to paint the walls with Notre Dame's blood in Miami, just like Alabama did. That's how close Georgia is to a national title. You fast forward 3 years. Alabama's already lost a game in the regular season. They're coming into your building, you're favored, and they just thrashed them. 38-10, I want to say it was. Pouring down rain, miserable day. If you're a Georgia Bulldog fan, that was about the last time you were ever going to take Mark Richt's odds of winning a national title at Georgia seriously. Fast forward 2 more years. You've got a new head coach. He's in his 2nd year, and he gets you to the SEC championship game. You avenge your loss to Auburn. You go to the Rose Bowl. What a scene out there in Pasadena, semifinal game. You go to overtime. You beat the University of Oklahoma, and guess where you're headed? You're headed to Atlanta, Georgia for the national championship game in your own backyard. And there you are at halftime, and you're shutting that team out, and they put a true freshman in at quarterback, and they come back, and they beat you in overtime in one of the most unforeseen manners imaginable. And that's how close you were to another national championship. And the very next year, in the same building, in the SEC championship game, you are owning them on the line of scrimmage, and the quarterback that came in to beat you the year before gets knocked out, and the one that got benched the year before comes in, and they come back and beat you again, and you're that close to going on to possibly play for another national championship. That team right there, for all you know, has cost you 1, 2, 3 shots, maybe 4, at least 3, at a very, very real possibility of winning a national championship. You measure yourself against them. You have gotten the guy who runs the program in Tuscaloosa's old defensive coordinator as your man. He's from Bainbridge, Georgia. He has recruited lights out. He's out-recruited Alabama in a couple of cycles, and yet you keep on coming up against a brick wall, and it looks like it cracks, but you just bounce off of it. You've got, to me, a Tier 1 program in the University of Georgia. People have argued with me on that because they haven't won a championship. But I don't view, when I'm tiering teams, I'm not doing it by trophy case. I'm doing it at what level are they operating at currently. And that program in Athens, Georgia, has got a loaded roster. They are a powerhouse program. They just exist in the same era. They have existed in the same stretch where the greatest dynasty in the history of college football has. How would Les Miles be remembered? How would LSU have been remembered pre-Ed Orgeron differently if they didn't exist? How would Mark Richt, for that matter, have been remembered if he didn't have to compete in the same era that Nick Saban was at Alabama? But the bottom line is he does. And that brings me back, by the way, to 2017. I thought for all the good that the college football playoff has done for us, when you're talking about the flavor of this Georgia-Alabama rivalry, the college football playoff robbed us in 2017. 2017, if you have forgotten how it shook out, yeah, you know the game. Yeah, you probably even remember the semifinals. I was in New Orleans for Alabama-Clemson. That was pretty easy, relatively speaking, an easy win for Alabama. And it was a classic in the Rose Bowl, Georgia-Oklahoma. And you set up this titanic showdown, at least for those of us in the South, Alabama versus Georgia. But what you probably don't remember is all the buildup, because there was none. Because the game took place 7 days later. And it was one that deserved such a better and stretched out buildup. I remember, I used to watch pro wrestling a lot. And when you're talking promotion, that is the world that pro wrestling exists in. It's all about promotion. One of my favorite main event fights or matches, if you will, of any era was Steve Austin versus The Rock at WrestleMania 17. 2001. It was in the Astrodome in Houston. And the buildup was months and months in advance. And they promoted it perfectly. I've never seen a more perfectly put together buildup to a big money main event level match. And so that was very well done. That's the way this kind of game should be treated. But instead it had 6 days once you get back home. And so the buildup should have been so much more. I remember thinking to myself, okay, we just had Alabama over Clemson. Remember, Clemson had beaten Alabama in the championship game the year before. So there had been a year-long build-up to that. Bama gets over Clemson. Georgia in the playoff for the first time. They get over Oklahoma, and you want to decompress. And all I'm doing is going and sitting in a press box or standing on a sideline. I remember getting home from New Orleans thinking, oh, man, this next game's 6 days away? I'd love to do a week of reaction for what we just saw, and then another week's build-up, and nope, didn't have it that way. So that's the only thing that I didn't like about 2017. I also thought it was just trash to expect Georgia to go all the way to the West Coast, play an overtime, emotionally draining game, and you're going to come right back and play a national title game. Biggest game in your program's history in a generation or two, 6 days later. I digress. Week 3 this year, this game happens. Don't know if it's going to be on schedule. Don't know how many people are going to be in the stands, but it is currently slated to take place in week 3. So just keep this in the back of your mind as the season, as scheduled, slowly but steadily approaches.